This is Wittgenstein's Philosophical Investigations. A strange book, not what you would expect a book named Philosophical Investigations to be. Open the book at any point and you will see separate paragraphs like this. These paragraphs are the investigation. When you start reading the preface, it seems as if Wittgenstein is preparing the reader that you shouldn't be you shouldn't be intimidated by this book, by the way it appears, not entirely put together, as if the author has died and has left behind some isolated, scattered thoughts, and now you are left with the burden of bringing them together. Don't think of it like that. Think of it more as following the originality of the thought. And this is what Wittgenstein himself is saying in the preface. Now I'm going to read that out. The thoughts that I publish in what follows are the precipitate of philosophical investigations which have occupied me for the last 16 years. They concern many subjects, and now he starts listing down some subjects. The concepts of meaning, of understanding, of a proposition and sentence, of logic, the foundations of mathematics, states of consciousness, and other things. I have written down all these thoughts as remarks, and he has remarks or Bemerkungen in German italicized. So he's saying that these are remarks, not typical writing, philosophical writing. So he says, I have written down all these thoughts as remarks, short paragraphs, sometimes in longer chains about the same subject, sometimes jumping in a sudden change from one area to another. And what were the areas again? The subjects, the concepts of meaning, of understanding, of a proposition and sentence, of logic, the foundations of mathematics, states of consciousness, and other things. And now Wittgenstein starts talking about why the book appears in the form that it does. Why has he written down all these thoughts as remarks, short paragraphs? Originally, it was my intention to bring all this together in a book whose form I thought of differently at different times. So, it was his intention to bring all this together in a book, all this together, all these separate subjects, all these separate paragraphs, bringing them together in a book whose form I thought differently at different times. So, while the intention of the book was clear to him, that he was writing all of this or jotting all of this down for a book, the form of the book kept changing. So there was this concept of a book already in his mind when he was going through writing or jotting down these investigations. But this was an investigation of its own. What will the book be like? What will the form of the book be like? And it kept changing. And now Wittgenstein writes, but it seemed to me essential that in the book, the thoughts should proceed from one subject to another in a natural, smooth sequence. After several unsuccessful attempts to weld my results together into such a whole, I realized that I should never succeed. So when he says, I should never succeed, he means to make the thoughts proceed, to order the thoughts in a way that there is a natural, smooth sequence from one subject to another. And those subjects span proposition and sentence, states of consciousness, and all the other things that he mentioned. So somehow or the other, the best that I could write, he says, the best I could write would never be more than philosophical remarks. But we have to note, when he says would never be more than philosophical remarks, he of course implies that these will not also be any less than philosophical remarks. They're not remarks in general. They are philosophical remarks. That means they have a specific intention behind them. And intention in German is Absicht. And Absicht, and does he use the word Absicht here? Yes, meine Absicht war. So he uses the word Absicht, and Absicht has the word Sicht in it, something to do with seeing, something to do with having the vision of a book. So here, when he says, the best I could write would never be more than philosophical remarks, this is a coming down to the realization that the form arrives. The form arrives with what he has written. He cannot force what he has written into a form. And then he says, my thoughts soon grew feeble if I tried to force them along a single track against their natural inclination. So there was a certain force, a certain almost a law of the text, which was bringing all these paragraphs not only out of Wittgenstein but also propelling him forward in his own thoughts. So it wasn't as if he was entirely um, he was entirely going to artificially construct a form and benefit from it. In fact, his own thoughts grew feeble as soon as he tried to bring them to a single track against their natural inclination. And this was, of course, he says, connected with the very nature of the investigation. For it compels us, it meaning the investigation, philosophical investigation, compels us, forces us to travel crisscross in every direction over a wide field of thought. Now, it's very important to see how here he says, my thoughts soon grew feeble if I tried to force them along a single track against their natural inclination. So there is, in that sense, a natural way of the thoughts to proceed, a natural force that accrues to the thoughts. You cannot force them into a form which is already ready made, which is well understood, which is known to everyone. You cannot exchange philosophical investigations where you are yourself struggling with problems, and somehow or the other give them a form which is stable, which is well known, which is immediately understood. Because if you do that, then there is this artificial distinction between form and content, where on the side of form you seem to possess knowledge that you haven't really thought through. And I think Wittgenstein is actually quite eloquent over here and quite explicit over here in this regard, because he says this was, of course, connected with the very nature of the investigation. For it compels us, just like our thoughts, or along with our thoughts, or in our thoughts, to travel crisscross in every direction over a wide field of thought. The philosophical remarks in this book are, as it were, a number of sketches of landscapes which were made in the course of these long and meandering journeys. Beautiful. He says, the philosophical remarks are a number of sketches of landscapes. So the landscapes are, even if we think the landscapes are the landscapes of concepts, of propositions, of philosophy, it's not as if the sketches themselves are the journeys. The sketches are very consciously sketches. They are not exhausting the reality of those journeys that he has undertaken in thought, those adventures that he has undertaken in thought. The philosophical remarks are simply a number of sketches of landscapes. But he's not saying, here is the place that I visited. These are just sketches. And these journeys were also, they had a certain continuity about them. They were not marked by sudden jumps, sudden cuts. It is, they had a particular natural inclination. They had a particular enduring of their own. So that's why he says these long and meandering journeys. And from these journeys, all that has remained are these number of sketches. And then he writes the same or almost the same points. And it's to a new reader, the philosophical investigations might appear very repetitive in some ways. And he kind of accepts it, recognizes it, and says, the same or almost the same points were always being approached afresh from different directions, like visiting the same place perhaps, and new sketches made. Very many of these were badly drawn. Very many of these sketches were badly drawn or lacking in character, marked by all the defects of a weak draftsman. Now, when he says lacking in character, he says two things over here. Very many of these sketches were either badly drawn or lacking in character. So, when he says lacking in character, he doesn't say badly drawn, right? He, perhaps they're well executed. Perhaps he has explained a particular thought well, but it lacks in character. By that, he possibly means that what is so unique about that thought doesn't come across in the writing. What is so fascinating, what is so surprising about that thought doesn't come across in the writing, perhaps. So then Wittgenstein writes, and when these badly drawn or lacking in character sketches were rejected, a number of halfway decent ones were left, which then had to be arranged and often cut down further in order to give the viewer an idea of the landscape. So, this book is really just an album. So, we are going to take a look into this album, and we are going to start not from the beginning, but somewhere in between. And we'll just, okay, we'll just read this paragraph 331, where he writes, imagine people who could only think aloud. Okay, just like that. Imagine people who could think only aloud. That's a fascinating imagination. That's a fascinating thought experiment. Usually, when we are conversing, silence is one of the things that we take for granted. And silence is not based on not understanding. When you're patiently listening to someone or you're in the middle of a pause in your own speaking, that silence is meaningful. It's not as if every time one pauses, one is not thinking. In fact, quite the contrary. Sometimes when we are speaking and there is this uh, pause or this awkward pause that arises in a conversation between two people, it is more likely than not that uh, both of them are thinking furiously but unable to come up with anything. But in this case, we are imagining people who can think only aloud. So, what will happen to conversations in that case? If the only thoughts that you can have are the thoughts that can be heard, and when you are not speaking, then there is no thinking going on. Imagine the conversations happening there. And it's not just a question of a breach of privacy, where anything that you're thinking is like in a society of telepaths, everyone else can hear it. Of course, that can also be. But here the problem is, how will you converse? Because at every point, there is no thought behind what you're saying. So there is literally no thought behind what you're saying, but whatever you're saying is thought. So essentially, Wittgenstein is playing around with this concept or with this idea that we usually have. He's trying to problematize this idea that anytime we speak something, there is a thought behind it. There's a thought underlying it. Perhaps without the words, you will arrive at that thought. Things like that. So he's saying, imagine people who could think only aloud. There is no other thought. And then in brackets, he writes, as there are people who can read only aloud. So this is a very, first there is this unfamiliar example. And after that, a very grounded in a very familiar example, but problematizing the familiar example as well. People who can read only aloud. So they read it, but they read, let's say, a sentence, but they don't understand it. Now, how will you, the listener, understand that this person who is reading out from a book understands what he's reading? because sometimes that's not the case, right? So as there are people who can read only aloud, but maybe not with understanding. Maybe if I pick up a book on quantum mechanics and start reading it out loud, I will read it, at least the sentences, but I will not understand any of it. So essentially, I will be reading out aloud, but whatever I am reading need not necessarily be accompanied by understanding as we know it, or thoughts as we know it. So in the next proposition, Wittgenstein develops this thought further. He says, true, we sometimes call accompanying a sentence by a mental process thinking. Nonetheless, that accompaniment is not what we call a thought. So there is a mental process that we call, okay, this is a, there is a, whenever we speak or read, there is some thinking going on. We are not thoughtlessly not like machines. We are not just speaking. We are not just speech apparatuses. Nonetheless, that accompaniment is not what we call a thought. So it is not as if that particular relation between the sentence and the mental process, that is not thought itself, unlike people who can only think aloud. And then Wittgenstein starts talking about what we can do. So you will see a lot of this in the philosophical investigations where he says, do this, do that, and then tell me. So utter a sentence and think it. Utter it with understanding. Two things. Utter a sentence and think it, and then utter it with understanding. And now you don't utter it and just do what you accompanied it with when you uttered it with understanding. Okay, I'll repeat that. Utter a sentence and think it. So he has already cleaved uttering from thinking. Now utter it with understanding. So let's say you're reading out something from a book and it's an unfamiliar book. You pick up a sentence and you start reading. So you utter the sentence and then you think it, you understand. What is it all about? What did I just read? And then the second step arrives, which says, utter it with understanding. This time around, when you read it out, utilize the thinking that you've already done and speak as if you understand it. Not as if, but because you understand it. But now comes the problematic part. Now don't utter it. Do not read out the sentence. Do not speak the sentence that you have just read, understood, thought. Don't utter it and just do what you accompanied it with when you uttered it with understanding. Now, when you uttered it with understanding, you had already gone through the process of thinking on it, of first reading it without understanding, and then suddenly he's asking you not to utter it, but do just what you accompanied it with when you uttered it with understanding. Now, I don't know what I accompanied it with. Did I accompany it with some thoughts about how I can finally understand it? Did I accompany it with thoughts that maybe I'll get this sentence wrong? Maybe I'll forget what I understood. So I'm not very sure. So immediately one understands that this is more complicated than it appears at first. This thing about thinking, this thing about thought, this thing about understanding. And this book is a wonderful tool, wonderful toolbox, in fact, not a tool, a toolbox for thinking.